So this is one out of 3 street art tours that I curated based off of commonalities and strategies that I identified while analyzing various pieces of street art. So as for the content of this presentation, the first strategy that I identified was the use of logos, name brands, flags, symbols, just a lot of codification is occurring in the Parisian street art scene and street art in general. And so what I found was that, for example, street artists tend to use famous brands such as logos that are instantly recognizable, such as the Nike logo. Like when I show you this Nike logo, you're instantly drawn to it. You understand that it's about the swoosh, it's about Nike, it's about just do it. There's a clear message encoded within the logo. Street artists like to do this, and you'll see various examples throughout this tour. Another way that street artists will use sort of my first strategy is when a street artist gains a certain level of notoriety, they almost become their own logo to the point that their pieces are instantly recognizable to everybody or to people who are aware. Just like how if you didn't know what Nike was, you wouldn't know what this logo represents. So it becomes distinguishable to people who know it. So as previously said in the first slide, but illustrated in the second slide, these are the examples where you're able to see strategy number 1 taking action. So you can see in logos and popular symbols. And so that brings us to our first piece. So for this example, I decided to use the work of street artist A Squared. Now this specific example is located in the Butokai neighborhood in the 13th arrondissement. Now, this specific piece has a double meaning. The double meaning is amour and anarchie. So in English, this is love and anarchy, and this is really exemplified by the capital A standing for anarchy, and the heart behind it representing love. Now this is supposed to sort of illustrate the street artist's love of anarchy, and actually has very deep meaning. So this piece is inspired by the Paris Commune. Now the Paris Commune was a very important time for Paris, and it was from March 18th, 1871 to May 28th, 1871. And the goal of the Paris Commune was to overthrow the government that was in place at the time. Now, during the Paris Commune, various buildings were burnt down, such as a whole section of the Louvre, and this sort of rebellion was led by feminists, activists, and they were all students, and these people really wanted to change. And that brings us to Louise Michel, which is also one of this artist's biggest inspirations, and Louise Michel is actually codified into this logo. Now, Louise Michel was sort of like a really important figure during the Paris Commune. She was a teacher and had very strong feminist beliefs. And throughout the Paris Commune, she was there throughout a lot of the battles, and she really sort of led this movement and was a key figure. Now, Louise Michel has become a very important figure in the punk community, which is why we can see here another piece by A Squared, which is actually located pretty close to this piece. We are able to see Louise Michel with sort of a mohawk on her head, which is a traditional punk hairstyle. Now, down below is the original portrait. Now, through all of this representation of Louise Michel, she's really become a symbol of perseverance and anarchy in the street art community, as well as the punk community and in history. Now, this is only one of the hundreds of examples found in Paris. So throughout all of my primary research that I've conducted in several of Paris's arrondissements, I found examples of A Squared in the 16th, the 5th, the 4th, the 11th, the 13th. I've really found this artist everywhere. Now, this can be seen in our second example, where we see A Squared all the way in the 4th. Now, this really speaks to the artist's reach and notoriety. And as stated before, the goal of A Squared is really just to put this symbol everywhere until it becomes codified, until people understand the message behind it, and to sort of keep the Paris Commune relevant, because this artist really feels as though it was an extremely important time in history and that it doesn't deserve to be forgotten. And here we can see another example of it on the Pont d'Iéna, which is really just a perfect place to put this sort of symbol that memorializes a time that's very important to the artist. So the Pont d'Iéna is a very frequented bridge. It's right in front of the Trocadéro, which is one of Paris's main tourist attractions. Now this brings us to the 4th example of strategy number 1. So for this, I selected Opération Colombe. Now, Opération Colombe was a street art marketing initiative led by Médecins du Monde. Médecins du Monde is an organization that really works with providing healthcare to those in need, mainly universal healthcare. Now, Médecins du Monde has over 355 medical programs, and their main causes are to raise awareness about HIV and protect against STDs in countries where that's not necessarily accessible. Now, their whole project was that in 12 cities, 12 street artists would paint their own sort of portrayal of Opération Colombe. So this street artist decided to use Médecins du Monde's official logo for this. Now, I found various examples of this piece, however, they were mainly in the 13th arrondissement. This is possibly because of the high concentration of street art found in the 13th. Now, that brings us to location. So, this is located on Rue de Croulebarbe in the 13th arrondissement, specifically, once again, in the Butte de Caille area. Now, just for some more background information on Opération Colombe, so the main goal of Opération Colombe was to really commemorate the 35 years of hard work that Médecins du Monde put into accomplishing the several missions that they've put out. Now, originally, Médecins du Monde only believed that they would complete one of their missions, which started in 1986, and that they would complete it by 1987. However, this project then led on to 35 years with over 355 successful medical programs, all fighting for universal healthcare. Now, I found this as a really good example of strategy number one, as all of this message and all of this commemoration is all codified into this symbol, which is actually their logo. So not only is it the use of a logo, which fits into strategy number one, but it's also... So that brings us to the next example of strategy number one. Now, this is found in this piece created by Heartcraft_street art. Now, this street artist really wants to leave the entire piece up to interpretation. Now, as we can see, there are two figures in an embrace. Now, it's intentionally made unclear the genders of both of the figures, and it's intentionally left out their background, their religion, their race. So this is really just to represent unconditional love, and the goal of Heartcraft_street art is to sort of push for this love is love, this message that love should not be constrained by background, by physical appearance, or by any obstacles or judgments that two people in love may face. Now, this specific example is found on Rue Gérard in the 13th arrondissement, once again in the Butte de Caille area. Now, there are actually multiple examples throughout Paris, likewise of A squared with the Anarchie Amour. I also found examples of this in the 5th arrondissement. Now, as you're able to see, the main reason why this fits into strategy number one is because all of this message is once again codified into this logo that's easily recognizable, just two figures in a loving embrace within a heart. Now, this logo is also sometimes subverted by the artist in order to represent different messages. However, this is the most common one that we're able to see around Paris. So just for a change from the 13th arrondissement, here we are in Le Marais in the 4th arrondissement, specifically on Rue Vieille du Temple. Now, this piece is by Easy K. Now, Easy K is one of the most influential and game-changing contemporary street artists. Easy K really incorporates different techniques, mainly stencil techniques, in order to spread his message. Now, we're able to see the use of logos, of branding, in order to communicate a very, very important and nuanced message. Now, the use of wordplay is extremely apparent in this piece. So it's in French, and it translates to, "In what world are we living in?" Now, this wordplay is made possible because Louis Vuitton is Louis Vuitton in French, and Vuitton directly translates to live in. So, translated, this phrase is, "What world are we living in?" Now, the way that I'm able to interpret this message is the way that our world values and prioritizes the wrong things. So we're able to see a very luxury brand used here. Louis Vuitton has this sort of notoriety for being extremely expensive, extremely sought after, and a very just overall luxury brand. So for this to be used as a monogram and just portrayed on this bucket where this child is bathing really just shows this like juxtaposition between poverty and the rich. And it's really, the catchphrase is really telling us like in what world are we living in where our priorities are more focused on luxury brands and having all of these pieces than helping people who are in much worse situations than us. Now, EZK has become really sort of easily distinguishable through the use of these luxury brands. There are other examples in which he uses brands such as Cartier and Nike in order to communicate similar messages. So we're obviously able to see that EZK street art is sort of a judgment on society, which I found to be the majority of street art. However, through an interview with street artist C plus S, I found that not all street art necessarily is a comment on societal norms and the way that our society functions, but a lot of it is just freedom of speech and expression. So in the same neighborhood, this brings up to our seventh example for strategy number one. Now, being in the Marais, on location precisely Café de la Gare, this is the work of Monsieur Chat. Now, Monsieur Chat is honestly one of the most influential and iconic contemporary street artists of the 90s and the 2000s. Now, Mr. Chat is this Franco-Swiss artist who uses an aerosol graffiti technique to depict yellow smiling cats. Now, he has a really rich history with street art and was really like founded in the roots of it because of his sheer like optimism, and this cat has really become a symbol of perseverance and remaining happy after 9/11 incident with the Twin Towers. The general mood was very dark, very somber, and Monsieur Chat, his main goal was really to uplift people and keep them smiling with his smiling cats. So I was actually very lucky to find this piece, considering that a lot of his work has either been taken down or stolen, considering that he's such an iconic street artist. But there are examples of his work all around the world, specifically in New York, where he did a lot of his work. But Monsieur Chat really blew up after an incident that he had with the RATP, which is the sort of French metropolitan system. And so the RATP summoned Monsieur Chat to court in order to pay a fine of over 1,700 euros after he was caught illegally performing his graffiti in the metro station Châtelet. Now, considering that everybody really had so much admiration and support for Monsieur Chat, he actually gained support from a lot of officials. And this really shows how much street art has progressed. Like before, it wasn't even distinguished as a form of art, and now it has people sort of standing up and protecting street artists who only want to do good in the world. Now, I knew that this was a very good example to include in my tour because Mr. Chat has really become a logo in and of itself with this smiling cat. He's instantly recognizable, and he's this message codified within the cat is just such an important message. So right off the bat, very easily distinguishable. This is the work of one of the most well-known and recognizable contemporary street artists in the world, the Invader. So, as we can see here, a very large mosaic of a Space Invader from the 70s arcade game Space Invader is seen depicted on a very large scale on this building. So the Invader first began to gain traction in the early 2000s as small mosaics of Space Invaders and other pop culture references started appearing all around Paris and everywhere else in the world. So it's not uncommon that you've probably seen them around Paris, considering that there's almost 2,000 invaders in Paris and over 4,000 worldwide. And so this figure really speaks to the invader's influence and his notoriety. And as I mentioned before, street artists, once they get to a certain level of notoriety, their works sort of become logos and they're easily recognizable and distinguishable, which is precisely why I decided to categorize this piece by the Invader in strategy number one, which is codifying a message within a logo. And so this piece is found directly next to a work by Jeff Aerosol, which is next to the Centre Georges Pompidou in the 4th arrondissement. Now, if you walk over to Rue Vieille du Temple in the 4th arrondissement, you'll be able to see this piece by the Invader. Now, as previously discussed, the Invader likes to use codification and sort of this mosaic technique in order to represent his pieces. Now, this is an example of a historical figure being depicted with by the invader. Now, so this actually falls into two of my strategies, which is historical references and the first strategy, which is codifying a logo. Now, what I found quite interesting about this piece is that at no moment it tells us that it's Pablo Picasso. We're just able to understand from his iconic striped shirt. Now, this is interesting because this is a perfect example of codifying. This is sort of like this pixelated, very abstract piece in which you should not be able to tell that it's Picasso, but since the message behind it is that it's this historical figure, we're able to understand that, which really just falls straight into the category of this tour. And also another interesting fact is that this piece is put up in the same neighborhood where there's a museum dedicated to Pablo Picasso. And this example is actually very, very close to the museum as it's in the Marais neighborhood. Now, for the next two examples, these are just more pieces by the invader that I felt really communicated the whole codifying and pixelating a pop culture reference in order to sort of communicate this message. Now, here we can see Daffy Duck, yet it's not Daffy Duck. It's a pixelated version of Daffy Duck that we're only able to understand because we understand the message behind the piece. And it's a very heavily codified message. And as we're able to see here, it's on Rue Cardinal Lemoine in the 5th arrondissement, which is quite far from the previous pieces that we've been covering. Now, if we turn to Rue Girard in the 13th arrondissement, we'll be able to see the last example of invader that I included in this tour. And this is of a mosaic of a little chameleon. Now, this one isn't particularly a pop culture reference. It was just another example of to see the codification and how we don't actually know that this is a chameleon due to how heavily pixelated, how codified it is. The only attributes of this piece that are able to tell us that it could be a chameleon are, first of all, the camouflage. So we're able to see that Invader sort of used a similar color to the bricks, and one of the most iconic traits of a chameleon are its camouflaging capabilities. And in addition to the camouflage, we're able to see a curly tongue, which is also a main attribute of lizards. And so then we're able to make the inference that this is a chameleon. So last but definitely not least, we have another piece in the 13th arrondissement in the Butokai area once again, this time on Passage Barreau. This is a work of art by Mystique. Now, Mystique is an extremely important street artist. She basically pioneered street art for women. At the time, street art, as well as the conventional art scene, was more of a male-dominated industry, and many galleries often denied female painters simply for being female. Now, Mystique started to gain traction in the early 80s when the street art scene was at an all-time high. So she was looking for a medium to express herself, and Mystique found inspiration from her surroundings, and she decided to create street art without the constraints of gender inequalities, such as sex-selective galleries, and overall just being judged for her work. Now, Mystique's work is easily distinguishable and recognizable by her slender, dark-haired woman that she portrays and the clever wordplay that's often associated next to it. Now, this is a clear example of strategy number one, as not only has Mystique's notoriety, in a sense, made her work a logo, but her work is very easily recognizable and distinguishable in the same way that famous brands and companies' logos are. And so today, Mystique has become one of the most influential and sought-after French street artists. Her work is protected under law, saying that once put up, none of her work is able to be removed. Now, Mystique is often commissioned by restaurants or by stores in search of like sort of a mural or a piece in front of their store. Now, Mystique is a very good example of sort of these street art prodigies. Now, these are characterized by mainly the people who were famous during the boom of street art, which was during the 80s. People who were famous during this movement were Black Laura, Jeff Aerosol, Monsieur Chat as well, but he came later, and many more of these legends. Now, she gained a lot more traction from being a woman, as she really just pioneered street art for women. Like, she really made it possible, as it was, once again, as I said, a male dominated industry. Now, as we're able to see in this second example on Rue Jonas in the 13th arrondissement, this is what Mystique's character and her logo really looks like. It's this dark haired woman, and this one does not have a phrase next to it, but it usually has a little phrase. Like here, we see Tu me fais rêver pour mieux m'endormir. Now, this is sort of like a sassy, witty phrase in French. It's yeah, and this is how we're able to distinguish her work, which is why I really categorized her into strategy number one. And so this then brings tour number one to an end, and thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, do not hesitate to contact me on my school email. I will get back to you as soon as possible. And thank you. I hope you enjoyed.